Tensions are once again boiling over inside the European Union, and at the center of the storm is Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán. With a critical vote approaching on whether to renew EU sanctions against Russia, Orbán is signaling that he may exercise his veto power, something that has EU leaders deeply concerned, because this isn't just a political disagreement. Behind the diplomatic language and official statements lies a far more explosive issue. If sanctions fail to be renewed and Russia regains access to its frozen sovereign assets, European taxpayers could be left holding the bag for billions. The scale of what's at stake here is massive. Since early 2022, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, the West froze approximately $260 billion in Russian central bank reserves. That move was seen as a powerful financial strike, one that would pressure the Kremlin by cutting off its access to international capital. But the frozen assets didn't just sit there. The EU, in coordination with the US and other allies, began using those funds, at least on paper, as the financial foundation for supporting Ukraine's war effort. Most notably, a $50 billion loan was secured using those assets as collateral. But now that entire structure is at risk. Estonia, one of the EU's fiercest Russia critics, is sounding the alarm. Its foreign minister, Margus Tsakna, has made it clear. If Orbán blocks the renewal of sanctions and those Russian assets are unfrozen, Russia could legally reclaim up to $210 billion. That money would flow straight back to Moscow, funds that were supposed to be locked out of the war economy. And the EU, which used those frozen assets to back Ukraine's financing, would suddenly find itself exposed. If the assets vanish, the liability doesn't. Instead, it shifts to the EU and the United States. Under current arrangements, both Brussels and Washington could be on the hook for $20 billion each. That kind of financial obligation, especially at a time when Europe is already struggling with slow growth, inflation, and growing public unrest, is politically toxic. No government wants to explain to its citizens that they're now responsible for paying back loans made in Ukraine's name because sanctions fell apart. And while most of the EU is united in continuing pressure on Russia, Hungary has consistently taken a different approach. Orbán has repeatedly pushed for negotiations rather than escalation, and he's argued that sanctions have hurt Europe more than they've weakened Russia. His government has maintained warmer ties with Moscow than most other EU members, and this latest move, hinting at a veto, fits into a broader pattern of defiance that's now putting the entire EU financial and diplomatic strategy at risk. From Estonia's perspective, the issue isn't just economic. It's symbolic. Tsakna warned that returning those frozen assets would be a gift to Vladimir Putin. They go back to where they belong, to Russia, he said. That's a reward, not a punishment. For Estonia and other Eastern European countries, many of which have a long, painful history with Russian domination, the idea of letting Putin walk away with $210 billion is unthinkable. But there's also a growing unease within the EU about the long-term viability of its Ukraine strategy. With the war dragging on, US political support growing more fractured, especially with Donald Trump's influence on the rise, and European economies struggling, some leaders are starting to ask hard questions. How long can this be sustained? What happens if the public loses patience? And what if Hungary isn't alone in questioning the sanctions? The reality is that this isn't just a financial crisis waiting to happen. It's a test of unity. The EU's ability to act collectively depends on consensus, and Orbán's willingness to buck the consensus exposes just how fragile that unity can be. If Hungary successfully vetoes the sanctions, it won't just be about money flowing back to Russia. It will be a signal to the world that the EU's resolve is cracking, and that's what has European officials so alarmed. Because in this high-stakes geopolitical chess match, money is just one piece on the board. Control, influence, and the future of Europe's strategic credibility are all in play. And right now, with Orbán threatening to tip the balance, the outcome is anything but certain. The effort to return frozen Russian sovereign assets to their original owner is emerging as one of the most controversial and complex geopolitical challenges facing Europe today. At its core lies a legal and moral paradox. While international law generally supports the return of state assets to their legitimate owner, the European Union is actively working to ensure that doesn't happen, at least not under current circumstances. This isn't merely a financial or legal issue. It's a reflection of a deeper political strategy that some argue is designed to prevent any meaningful peace between Russia and Ukraine. By continuing to freeze Russian funds, the EU maintains leverage, but it also risks escalating the very conflict it claims to want to end. Roughly $190 billion of these Russian state assets are currently held in Belgium, specifically within Euroclear, a private financial institution that suddenly finds itself at the heart of a geopolitical storm. The EU, particularly Belgium, is walking a legal tightrope. According to reporting by the Financial Times, Member states are deeply concerned that forcibly seizing these assets would violate international law, destabilize trust in the Eurozone's financial credibility, and trigger a wave of legal challenges that could shake global confidence in Europe's role as a secure financial hub. Instead of moving forward with seizure, the EU has opted to keep the assets frozen. But this middle ground is becoming increasingly untenable. The pressure is mounting from within. Hungary's Viktor Orbán is pushing an even harder stance against continued sanctions, while Estonia, one of the EU's most vocal hawks on Russia, is now openly advocating for a far more aggressive move. Not just to freeze the assets indefinitely, but to seize them outright. Estonia's foreign minister recently proposed forming what he called a coalition of the willing, a phrase that intentionally or not harks back to the rhetoric used during the Iraq War. The idea is to band together key allies, including the G7, Norway, and others, to collectively confiscate the frozen Russian sovereign funds and ensure they are never returned. This would effectively cement a new precedent in international finance, one where geopolitics overrides long-standing norms of sovereign immunity and financial neutrality. But there's a major flaw in Estonia's strategy. The legal and political groundwork to support such a move simply doesn't exist, at least not yet. Seizing sovereign assets without a clear ruling from a competent international legal body could open the EU and its allies to lawsuits and countermeasures, not only from Russia, but potentially from other states concerned about the sanctity of their own reserves. In essence, Estonia is calling for a dramatic shift in how global finance operates, one that could have lasting repercussions well beyond this conflict. Time is also becoming a critical factor. The EU sanctions imposed on Russia are due to expire at the end of July, and under current rules, renewing them requires unanimous consent. With Orbán signaling his intent to block any extension, the entire EU sanctions framework could begin to unravel in a matter of months. Behind the scenes, negotiations are intensifying, and tensions are rising as leaders scramble to maintain unity. Adding another layer of complexity is the shifting position of the United States. Former President Donald Trump, who is once again a central figure in global politics, recently weighed in on the conflict with a statement that has sent shockwaves through European capitals. On April 23rd, Trump criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for refusing to compromise on Crimea. Zelensky can either have peace or lose his entire country, but one way or another, this war will end, Trump said, suggesting that continued insistence on reclaiming Crimea was not only unrealistic but actively harming the chances for peace. He questioned why Ukraine hadn't fought for the region when it was first annexed in 2014, and warned that ongoing intransigence was costing lives. Trump's statement implies that he is prepared to broker a peace deal, but on terms that could be far less favorable to Ukraine than the current Western position. And if Ukraine refuses to come to the negotiating table, he may well walk away entirely. This sends a chilling message to European leaders, who are now scrambling not only to maintain their internal consensus, but also to align with a U.S. foreign policy that could drastically shift after the next election. For the EU, this creates an impossible equation: maintain moral and legal credibility by adhering to international law, or throw caution aside and permanently seize Russian assets in an attempt to weaken Moscow and fund Ukraine's recovery. But in doing so, they may sacrifice the very legal principles that underpin global financial trust in the West. Critics argue that this ongoing stalemate is less about protecting lives and more about preserving geopolitical influence. If that's the case, the EU's current strategy could be as ethically fraught as it is politically unstable. The big question now is what happens if Hungary vetoes the renewal of sanctions this summer. That single act could collapse the EU's carefully constructed sanctions architecture and force a reckoning over its entire approach to the war. Meanwhile, Estonia's increasingly desperate calls to seize the assets at all costs signal growing anxiety that time is not on their side. As this story unfolds, one thing becomes clear: how the EU and its allies handle these frozen assets may ultimately define their credibility on the world stage. Are they defenders of a rules-based order, or opportunists willing to rewrite those rules for political gain? And with Trump poised to re-enter the negotiating arena, Europe might soon find itself sidelined in a conflict it helped shape, but may no longer control.